Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you can all hear me. Asad, if you can hear me well, if you can just give me a thumbs up so that I know I'm audible. Good morning to everyone joining us from the North American side, and a very good night for everyone here in Pakistan. And very excited to host a very special friend today, someone who keeps a very low-key profile but is without a doubt one of the best Pakistani investors in the valley. And I feel myself lucky that he took a bet on Bazaar. But he has a lot of good stories to share. So we'll dive straight into it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Saad. I'm the co-founder of Bazaar Technologies. Bazaar is a startup in Pakistan that helps small to medium-sized businesses seamlessly procure inventory and get access to financing. We're a Series B startup having raised $100 million, but with a very long way to go in terms of digitizing retail and different businesses in the country. Joining me today is Asad, who I consider myself very lucky to call a friend. It's also someone that has been a tremendous mentor and a true friend to Bazaar. So, Asad, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your story. But before we go into that, would just love for everyone to hear a little bit more about your story. What was it like growing up? How did you get into venture capital? If you can maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I think we have a lot of people here who are Pakistanis, but in tech, in many different types of industries within tech, but not in venture capital. So would be great to hear from you. How did the journey start? How did you get into venture capital? And where did AQ come from?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me and doing this together. It's gonna be fun, and very happy to be here. This is a good way to offset the sadness that Arsenal fans like myself are feeling right now. Um, so it's an interesting. I mean, to be honest, I had no interest in venture capital. I was always interested in new technology. You and I saw both kind of we grew up in the early sort of commercial internet, app store, smartphone, IoT, new forms of computing years, and the speed of development was really meaningful. The creativity was really meaningful. It's a really cool time, and it did feel in places like Pakistan at the time we would have to wait quite a bit to get access to products and tools that people had in other parts of the world. So it felt like the pool of innovation was somewhere else. I think it's very different. So I came to the US for college, my first time in the country. I was at Stanford. I was studying a combination of CS and engineering and thought I wanted to build software products. And, this is how life goes. I ended up meeting my current co-founders when I was still a student. One of my co-founders, Teresa, had just left a venture firm called Excel. And she was thinking about starting something new and different and what sort of the future of venture would look like. Um, and she can be very, very convincing. And I thought maybe venture could be an interesting way to practice evaluating ideas, companies, maybe even meet a company or a team that I'd want to work with or join. And then here we are a decade later. That's how life goes. Um, but in all seriousness, I mean, I was very lucky and privileged to meet a group of people early in my career that I knew I wanted to build something with long term. And then you realize you get to spend your whole day speaking to and working with founders, each of whom, like you are doing, are building their life's work, are sort of working on their calling. And you have to, by definition, always be learning. If you stay still, you're kind of falling back. And so the day to day was just really amazing and energizing. And so that's the story.
Awesome. Asad, you briefly mentioned college, and I think for the audience, you did spend, I think, 4 years at Stanford, where you were studying management sciences and engineering. And so probably it's not too clear from that degree that venture is something that you can really step into. There are probably a lot more things that you can do that you're thinking of. Obviously, being at Stanford, that is always a thing that you can do. But how did you even figure out that's something that you want to get into versus, becoming a programmer or becoming a product manager like myself? Like, for example, I never thought of venture capital even for a second when I was in college. I didn't even know what venture capital was,
Yeah.
or that I could do it. Probably still cannot do it, but how did you figure out that is a path that you would enjoy,
Yeah.
versus?
I mean, I think you have to, you have to find it by means of other things that you enjoy. And so I did. I really enjoy programming. I was taking a bunch of CS classes. I was not sure I wanted to be a CS major because, and people might on the call might know this in the US. Once you graduate, your work visa has to match your job has to match your degree. And so I wasn't sure I wanted to lock myself into only CS related jobs. And so luckily Stanford has a pretty, broad sounding major called management science and engineering, which is a combination of sort of undergrad, business classes, engineering classes. You can take a lot of CS classes and sub them in. So that's what I was doing, sort of keeping my options open in terms of professionally what I would transition to. And I actually, I those were the two options. Programmer or PM were the two things I was thinking about. And it just so happened that, by virtue of doing those things, you work with friends, you start building things, you start experimenting, which is just the spirit on campus at Stanford and I think in the area more broadly, obviously. Um, and in the process of doing that, naturally you end up meeting investors, because investors are always interested in, okay, what are the people who are, in academia, who are in research, who have a fresh perspective, what are they thinking about? And that was how I met, my co-founder, Teresa. And as I mentioned, she was sort of thinking about, having someone who had deeper exposure in CS and the engineering programs at Stanford be part of sort of, her team as she was thinking about leading Excel. And I thought as a temporary thing that could be interesting. I wish I could say there was a master plan, but honestly, it was something I intended to do for maybe a few months, and ideally meet a team that I could work with in product and engineering, and maybe even start something. But that's what happened to the plans. So yeah, and since then, as I mentioned, I think a big part of it was just the people, and so that led to a group of five of us starting Acrew Capital a few years ago, and here we are.
And what is AQ Capital? If you could, and obviously I know what capital is, they've invested in Bazaar, but what is the thesis? Because I know the first time we chatted with AQ, it was probably a very different type of conversation. It was not your plain Manila venture capital firm just talking about numbers. It was different. There was a thesis. There was something else that you were looking for. It was already organized into 2 to 3 different types of funds that were investing in 2 to 3 different types of ideas. And so, how did it go about? Who came up with the idea that we should start a venture capital firm? What was the thesis? And I think what would be really good for people to understand, if you can go into some detail on how does one go about starting a venture capital firm, right? Like what are all the steps you have to take in order to raise capital, in order to deploy capital, in order to find a team and build a team. So if you can just walk us through the entire journey of the early days of Acrew, the thesis, and where are we now?
Yeah, yeah, of course. Well, our main claim to fame is that we're investors in Bazaar, so we covered that one. So a group of five of us started the firm a few years ago, and we all came from a mix of different backgrounds. People had operational backgrounds, people had entrepreneurial backgrounds in venture, engineering, product. And we put a lot of time into thinking about, what are the things that we want to do differently? And we kind of, before we started the firm, we boiled it down to three things. And those are still the three kind of core pillars of the firm. The first one is collaboration. And it's in the reason that it's called Acrew is the crew is the focus. It's really a lot of venture firms will operate as a sort of collective of individuals almost in terms of how the firm works. And we wanted to make the case that you can actually practice venture as a team sport. And so when we invest in a company, everyone on our team is investing in that company and showing up to be helpful in various ways to that company. And each of us has a different set of skills, in terms of backgrounds, perspectives, networks, etc. And so we want the whole team to be a resource for our founders, and we want to be collaborative in how we, find, select, and work with the very best companies. So that was the first pillar, very important, was collaboration. Two was this notion of being thesis driven. And this sort of, this is not wholly unique. Obviously, if you look at my co-founder, Teresa, who came from Excel, they had this concept of prepared mind for many years. We thought we could evolve and iterate on that, of course. But, the foundation of startup investing is you have to be able to spot the outliers. Ultimately, it's an industry of outliers. But our perspective is you have to be prepared in order to do that well. So, you kind of mentioned this. We have three core areas of investment, which are data and cybersecurity, fintech, and then human health and empowerment. And in each of these spaces, we're constantly trying to develop our perspective and understanding. It does not mean we try to predict what is going to happen, but it means we want to be best positioned to be able to say yes when we meet a team that we think is really special and doing something really special. And it means we have to be able to be prepared to support them and to be the best partner to them. The third pillar is what we call diversity of perspective. And this, it's kind of tied to the collaboration piece. And that stems from a viewpoint that, you want a broad set of perspectives, data, viewpoints, networks, inputs into your ultimate investing practice. So we take a very broad view of what diversity of perspective means. There are obvious axes that a lot of people might think about. Like if you go look at our team, there's probably more immigrants than most venture firms, as one example. But then there are non-obvious axes in terms of people's backgrounds and experiences and the collective sort of breadth and depth of those experiences. So one way we try to show up for our founders is we build something we call the Crew of Leaders, which is a group of 500 execs, advisors, board members, et cetera, who come from a variety of backgrounds and fields. And again, all of them are signed up to be a resource for founders. So that's the story of the firm. We have an early stage practice, which is seed and Series A, a growth stage practice, which is Series B onwards. We're usually investing anywhere from 1 to 20, 25 million in a particular round. And we hope we are doing things in a way that we feel is differentiated, but also in a way that feels true to the values that we are trying to bring to the industry. And then, in terms of starting the firm, we were very privileged that we had actually, before we started Acrew, some of us had been working at another investment firm together. Actually, all five of us had been, and some of us in other roles, configurations, had worked together, going back 15 plus years in some cases. And so there was a sort of collective track record. There was a collective understanding that this was a group of people who really like to work with each other, which is a lot of what you want to think about when you're building a venture firm, because really venture firms are intended to be, in most cases, multi-generational institutions. And we put a lot of thought into, what do we think makes us differentiated, and over the long term, what do we think makes us differentiated and defensible? And it was those three pillars. And then you just have to go make the case to LPs. In our case, that's a lot of foundations, university endowments, pension funds, et cetera. And you have to share the story. You have to share your track record. You have to share, what you think gives you an edge in terms of being prepared, being able to get to know and access the most interesting opportunities, being able to win the most interesting opportunities. And everyone, almost by definition, everyone has their own version of that. And if anyone on the call is thinking about, maybe starting a fund or getting into venture, I'm always very happy to kind of talk about it and be a sounding board for that, because truly, I think it's different for everyone. But that was our story.
And what was the most challenging part of starting the fund? And what were some ways that you guys figured out how to navigate through it?
Yeah, I think that, the biggest thing when you start is you have a clean slate. You can do anything. And that gives you optionality. That gives you a world of things that you could go do. But you have to figure out what your edge is. And as a result, you have to figure out what your focus is. So you have to think about what the right constraints are for you. So, when we started, we only had an early stage fund. We were very clear about what our thesis areas would be. We were very clear about the ways in which we would work. We were very clear about what we wanted to bring to bear for our founders. And so what that does is two things. One is it gives you the ability to hone in on, okay, here are the things that I want to be really good at. But on the flip side, it also gives you an ability to say, here are the things I'm going to say no to. And I think that is in many ways the most important part actually of venture, is deciding what you're going to say no to, because it's a very broad universe. I mean, we can talk about some of the changes in venture over the past, 10, 15 years since we've been investing, but the industry looks very different. And there are a lot more players in the industry now. And so the ability to refine and pick what you are going to be good at and what you are going to build strength in is really, really important. And that was the most important exercise for us. So establishing what's the vision, what are you going to be known for, what are your pillars? And then, the most important part, I think, of any founding team is, what are your values? What do you want to be known for? What are the types of people you want to work with? And it was really important for us to be able to answer all those questions before we even started the fund. So a lot of the early days were just, get together as a team at someone's house and you have a whiteboard and you're just thinking about those questions. And until you answer those questions, you're not ready to start.
Yeah, no, definitely. Again, we'll get a little bit more tactical about you mentioned venture capital has changed a lot. And you've been doing this for the past 10 years. We'll get into that. Would love to hear how and what has changed. I do think that a lot of us who don't know a lot about venture capital do wonder what happens in a venture capital firm on a day-to-day basis. Yes, there are these partners that are talking to us, but being at the back end of it, what all is happening, who all works there, what is the role of each person, how are you making decisions, how many companies are you talking to, how are you deciding when to raise capital for yourself? And so can you talk a little bit about the operationality of a venture capital fund or a firm like yours, so that people on the call can understand a little bit more about what all happens when you're making a decision?
Yeah. So I think, day to day, one way to think about it is roughly three buckets. And depending on, the day, the season, the week, the allocation to those three buckets can change. So, one bucket is finding the best new founders and companies. And so, let's say that's 30% of it. And so that's where we're doing our thesis work. We do multiple offsites. We do at least 4 full team offsites every year. Within each of our thesis areas, we're getting together obviously much more frequently than that to figure out, what's happening in the world. What are the key technological shifts? What are meaningful societal, technological, and other changes that might result in different kinds of companies or new kinds of companies being successful. That's where we're meeting with, co-investors we might collaborate with. We're meeting with, for instance, we do a lot of, data infrastructure and cybersecurity investing. We have to spend a bunch of time with practitioners. We have to spend a bunch of time with academics. It's all an exercise in what's happening, what are people thinking about, what are people learning about, and what might that mean for an investing practice. The second bucket is working with our founders. And so that's the sort of, that is our model there is we don't want to be prescriptive in terms of telling people what they need, so we want people to tell us what's most important to them, where we can add the most leverage, and we will go make it happen for them. And there are obviously common buckets that breaks down into. A lot of the times it's future fundraising. A lot of the times it's thinking about the model of the business, things like pricing, go to market, etc. A lot of the times it's thinking about recruiting, hiring. And so can we help our founders and teams we work with find the best people, recruit the best people, etc. And it's our hope is we get to roll up our sleeves and work with you on whatever is most important to you. And we take guidance from our founders on what is most important to them, rather than, trying to have a big platform team that we send them to or whatever. So, that's bucket 2. And then bucket 3 is the operational bucket, right? It's true of any company, it's true of any startup, and it's true of us. So that's the, the internal stuff, the not so fun stuff, maybe for me at least, finance, accounting, whatever it is. And then fundraising, as just as our startups do, we raise capital every few years. The way that works is we have a model of how we want to deploy our funds, and that's one of the things that gives us discipline in terms of how we invest. We try to stick to that model, and part of that model is what our deployment period is of any given fund. So let's say maybe it's 3 years or so on average. That means we're going to be fundraising roughly every 2.5 to 3.5 years. And so we do that. We go do that from our LPs. And those three buckets, I mean, depending on the time, it's going to be different allocation. For example, we do these quarterly offsites. At that time, we might be thinking a lot about what's coming next, and a lot of energy might be going to that. Right now, 2 or 3 of the companies I work closely with are fundraising, so that means a lot of my time right now is going towards that. And then when we're fundraising, a lot of our time goes towards that third bucket. So the day-to-day can really shift, but I would say those 3 buckets are pretty consistent.
Awesome. There are some good questions coming in onto the chat as well, so we'll get to that also. But coming back to our question before, which is venture capital has changed a lot in the past few years. You've been doing it for a decade almost now, even prior to A2. And so, what have been the most significant changes that you have seen in venture capital since you started your journey?
I think, the biggest one I would say is just the huge growth in the industry. Not just venture capital, but the whole ecosystem, right? Venture capital, startups, etc. I think a little over a decade ago, I think 2010, I believe the number was there were roughly 1,000 VC-backed companies, and they were valued at 25, 30 billion or so in total. And last year, you had 15,000 plus venture-backed companies, and they were valued in the hundreds of billions combined. So you have more companies, you have more venture funds, you have more people in the industry, and so the most fundamental shift I think is the metabolism of the industry is faster, it increases. And there's really important consequences to that. So what do I mean by metabolism? Well, first of all, ideas and companies become legible faster. So what do we mean by legible? Let's say you see 3, 4, 5 companies doing the same thing, trying to solve the same problem. Grubhub, DoorDash, Postmates, Caviar. You get these clusters of companies, and so a little while later, you sort of have this understood and legible category of okay, food delivery is a cluster of companies. And I would say 2010, 2015, even a few years ago, that process might take 2 or 3 times as long as it does today. But the industry's grown, the speed of idea transmission has grown, pattern matching happens faster, and so we get the legibility faster. And so one consequence of that is, well, you have more capital, you have more companies, you have more legibility, and so capital can go into these defined categories faster. So if you look at deal volumes, I think 2012, 2013, 5 years from that, 2017, 2018, in those years, I think on average, early stage deal volume was 5-6 billion or so. And at the end of 21 and part of 22, I think equivalent period of time was more like 30 billion. That's just in the US. And so even if you account for, 2021 everyone was very excited that year, a lot of exuberance, that's a huge change. And so there's more funding, it goes into these categories faster, which are in turn more legible. And as a result, you sort of have these consensus categories emerge faster. What that also means is incumbents are more motivated to compete. So you look at a lot of the activity in AI right now, a lot of the times new startups, it's almost a trope at this point, will completely, get beaten by a company like Adobe or Microsoft, which historically we're used to thinking of them as sort of slower incumbents, but they'll incorporate new functionality really quickly now into their new existing product, and they have an existing distribution base. So there's good and bad to that increase in metabolism. I think it means, this baseline venture process of like research, iteration to commercialization to scale is happening faster. It means customers and employees and investors are energized and involved in a more meaningful way. But it can also mean some categories might have inflated expectations or investment before they're really ready. And so that can have these sort of pernicious effects down the line. By the way, it can also mean if you're building in a category that is not clearly consensus, you might have to climb a few more hills, which is something we love. I mean, one of the things, we like to say internally is we don't need founders to feel like their business has to fit in some category or in some box for us to get it or for it to be interesting to us. In fact, I would say some of the most interesting businesses historically have not. So there's been a lot of change. It has meaningful impacts for investors and founders. But there's also, a core foundation of the industry has stayed constant too, which is, I think, a sort of healthy venture and startup ecosystem is still one of the most powerful, efficient, organized, and meaningful ways to build huge companies that create a lot of change. And I think, this is, I remember conversations with you and Hamza when you guys were early on the Bazaar journey, talking about you didn't just want to create a big business, you wanted to build a lighthouse company, I think was the phrase you guys used, right, in Pakistan, because these ecosystems work as flywheels. And so the industry is also becoming much more global, which I think is a really good thing.
Yeah, and you briefly talked, Asad, about these unique startups that don't really fit in a box. And you guys have invested in some. Could you give us examples of some that you have personally invested in that maybe just didn't have a consensus as a category or as a thesis when you first look at it, but if you try to study it really deeply, there is something quite unique that is being built there. So what would be like 2 or 3 good examples of such startups that we could learn from?
Yeah. I think there's a few, and there's a few at various stages. I'll give you a couple. One is now a very large company, company called Chime in the US, which one of my partners, Lauren, had led our investment in 2015. And the thesis behind Chime, and the CEO has spoken publicly about this, right? It was not easy for them to raise some of their early rounds of funding. And their thesis was, if you look at the US fintech market, there are a lot of consumers who are living more paycheck to paycheck, who don't have huge savings balances, who don't have huge sources of funds or income, who are underserved by all the incumbent banks. And the sort of traditional wisdom had been, well, that's not a good audience for banks to really invest meaningfully in. And so people didn't see that as a category that was interesting. And the Chime founder said, actually, we think if you build an incredible product, this is, not only are these people who deserve a better product, but actually will be the source of a huge amount of product innovation and growth if we make that investment. And I think, Chris, the CEO of Chime, has talked about that. I mean, I think he got like 100 no's as part of that process. And Lauren had been doing some work in the space, and she sort of had this resonance on this idea of, look, there's an underserved group of people, and we've got to build something for them. And so we decided to make the investment in Chime. And there's a recent interesting profile on them in Forbes, because they're, I think, thinking about IPO and future plans for the company. And they're one of the largest, fastest growing banks in the US now. But it came from this insight that was maybe a little bit contrarian at the time. I'll give you another example that is a more recent one. We invested in a company called Vanta, which is a cybersecurity company, where the insight the founder Christina had was, traditionally security was something that you built once you were sort of big enough, and you had things to worry about when it came to securing a business, and it was almost something that was more an afterthought for startups and for smaller businesses. And one thing Christina noticed, she was at Dropbox, and she had noticed this dynamic in this growing startup category, was that a lot of startups needed security certifications, things like SOC 2, GDPR compliance, HIPAA compliance, whatever it is, that were long, multi-month, super manual, auditor-driven processes. And they were often the first time that a startup thought about security as a practice. And so, she said, well, why don't we productize that? Why don't we automate that? And in doing so, we become the core of that company's security practice before they even think about building it. And so that gives us a wedge into growing and becoming their sort of center of gravity for cybersecurity. And that business, they've shared this publicly, but has gone. They're at more than 100 million ARR. They've got 7,000 plus customers, and a lot of those customers were historically a market people weren't going after, which was startups, SMBs, people that were building their early business. So those are two examples. There's obviously newer ones too that the story is still to be told, but hopefully that gives an idea of the kind of things that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I'll ask you a controversial question. It's one of my favorite questions to ask VCs, because I think it's a good way to reflect for both us as startup founders and also sometimes as venture capitalists on things we do get wrong. And I think founders get a lot more things wrong than investors. But what are some unique startups like these that you missed out on, which were like, this makes no sense to me. I don't even know what the hell are you talking about. And they just turned out to be incredible businesses.
Yeah.
There's someone that comes to your mind which you were like, okay, yeah, it makes so much sense looking backwards.
Yeah. Well, I think every investor and every investment fund has their sort of anti-portfolio of things where, things maybe didn't make sense or didn't make enough sense. And then the dots become a line in hindsight, of course. One for me, and maybe I'm thinking of this because Ali had a comment about AI pitches in the chat. A business we spent a lot of time with over the years was a business called Runway, which is they use machine learning AI to generate video, and they're is an incredibly creative, visionary team that has been thinking about this space for years and years before image and video generation really became something that people were talking about, thinking about. And they had done foundational research that's still powering a lot of these new video generation or image generation demos that you might see. And they had this strong thesis that was the future of creative work, and not just that. Their vision was a very positive one in that they said this is going to empower creative. This is going to augment what we can create. CGI didn't replace movies; it added. And we think this is going to be something similar. And it was a business we sort of spent a bunch of time with over the years, and we had gotten to know the founders, and we always thought incredibly highly of the team. But the clarity of, okay, how do you productize this? How do you commercialize this? What does it really take to integrate into people's workflows and take that to market? Truthfully, this, the first meetings many years ago was really blurry. And, we had to get comfortable with what's the right level of risk versus sort of, where can we see clarity and what could go right? And I think in that instance, we got it wrong. So that's one example. There's plenty more. And I think those guys are now doing some really interesting, exciting things. And I'm looking forward to seeing where they go, which is, that part is always fun.
Yeah, no, it's you can't always shoot right, but talking a little bit more about that, you've invested over the last 10 years, early stage investing, obviously in the context of Acrew is very thesis driven, but it's also a punt on the founder. Late stage, yes, you have a lot more data, a lot more numbers to really figure out where is this business heading. But early stage, you're taking a punt on founders, you're taking a punt on a lot of first-time founders who might have worked at some good companies, sometimes not at all, but you just think, they have something that you want to back. And so what are you looking at, and having done a decade of investments, what are some common traits you have seen in successful founders that helps you make a decision faster?
Yeah. Well, I think you touched on a very important thing, which is, I think the basis of venture capital and startups is, you can't predict the future. In fact, there's a book I recommended anyone's interested in the venture industry called The Power Law by Sebastian Mallaby, which is sort of about the history of venture as an industry. And he says it, I think, a really nice way, which is the future can be discovered, but it cannot be predicted, is the core of the essence of the venture industry. And so you sort of, it may not always feel that way when you talk to VCs, but fundamentally the industry is sort of an exercise in intellectual humility, right? Because you're acknowledging that, and therefore you're acknowledging that the people who do that may come from anywhere, right? And so if it could be first-time founders, it could be someone who's an outsider to an industry, someone who doesn't fit the mold, whatever it is. People like that can be some of the very best sources and forces to catalyze the discovery of the future. And I think the really beautiful thing about venture and startup as an ecosystem is we've sort of, this collective agreement of, well, if someone has a good idea, let's empower them to go run that experiment to see if we can discover that version of the future. Is a really, really powerful one. But the core of it, obviously, as you mentioned, is the founders. And it's interesting. I mean, there's that famous JFK speech about going to the moon, and he talks about how the U.S. made the decision to invest in the space program, and he says, we do these things, we choose to go to the moon and do all these things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And there's almost a joke I've heard of that from some founders I work with, where it's like, they would actually say, we did this not because it was easy, but because we thought it would be easy. And it's sort of silly, but I think it gets a really important truth, which is, I think the very best founders are almost naive to the scope of the challenge in front of them. When they start something ambitious, you have this notion of being able to change things in ways that would appear completely impossible to a lot of people. You really have to set your sight high enough, and I think that's the really, really important part of the mix. And I think back to conversations you and I and Hamza have had about the expansion of Bazaar, right, from retail to industrial to fintech to office to private label, whatever it is, and it was the most natural thing in the world, right, that would fall under Bazaar's ambitions. And so you have to be strategically, I think, ambitious in a certain way. And by the way, I'm sure when you guys started the company, I mean, you might be sitting here after your IPO looking back and saying, wow, if we knew all the ups and downs, like, would we really have done that? And I don't know. So I think that's a big one. You have to have that level of ambition. I think you have to combine it with really deep conviction. That conviction doesn't have to be, obstinate or dogmatic, but you've got to have some belief and fundamental belief and a vision of the future. And that has to drive you. I think that's really important. Speed, I think, is critical. I think if you go back to this idea of, look, we're discovering the future, you've got to experiment to make those discoveries. The more experiments you do, the quicker you learn, the faster you metabolize that learning, and the better you can be. So the willingness and drive to do that, I think, is really important. And then, I think tactically there's a quality. I mean, something you have to do every day, right? Is you take in a bunch of disparate inputs and you have to process them really productively. You have investors, sometimes saying useful things, sometimes saying useless things. You have co-founders, you have employees, you have shareholders, you have customers, you have partners, parents, friends. Everyone's got thoughts and opinions, and everyone will give you different inputs and perspectives. And so as a founder, you have to take all these in, and you have to focus the business in a way that is optimal. And you can't be unduly influenced by anyone. And that's hard. That's really, really hard. But the best founders do it really well, and they learn to do it really well. And, I don't think that's an exhaustive list. Those are, I think, some of the most common characteristics we see. And you could ask different people and get a lot of different answers to that question. And the truth is, most founders individually will really spike at 1, 2, maybe 3 of those things, or whatever their strengths are. And so, identifying those for yourself and making sure your co-founders have a complementary set of skills, if there are areas where you think you don't, is really, really important. So those are some of the things we look for. And then I guess the last thing I would say is, and I'm very grateful, this is true for all the founders that, I'm lucky to work with, is they're all wonderful, incredible humans. And that is really important for us. It's really important for me. Because these are long-term relationships. You want to share the right set of core values. You want to have pride in working with each other. And I think it makes you work better together. So those are some of the things that we would look for.
No, thanks for sharing that. And again, thank you for taking a punt on Bazaar quite some time ago. I still remember you asking us this question, which was the first time a VC asked us this question is, what would make you choose us? Um, and I think that speaks a lot about you as a person, and that speaks a lot about your firm. Um, and I remember telling you, at least our thesis was, uh, this is a long game. We have to build the company out for the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, whatever it takes. And so every person joining the team, which is a colleague that is joining the company in some role, or an investor, has to be someone that we can spend a day and night 24/7 with. That's the question we ask. And that's the question you ask. Also, you shared about how hard can it be, I think, for anyone that is thinking about starting a company or even thinking about starting a firm, it's a lot harder than it seems.
Yeah.
You just have to be delusional that you are doing something that is making a difference. And you just have to be quite obsessed with the purpose and the mission of what you're doing, because there will be moments where you just don't want to do it. But if the purpose is there, if the why is clear, a lot of those things will just feel like small hurdles towards a very long-term and very meaningful objective and outcome. And so at least that's what I have learned. And I think that actually applies to even the people that join your company, right? There will be a lot of people that join your company that are very mission driven and they believe in the purpose. As you scale the organization, you're in thousands of colleagues. Not everyone will be that attached to the mission. They're here because they want to do a job, and you will have some of those, and that's okay. You need some people who are excellent at doing jobs and are just not missionaries. But they will leave and they will move on when things don't feel that way, right? So I think in many cases, you have to find that mission within yourself first, and then you have to find that mission within the people that join you, because you and those people will take it forward for the next 10 to 15 years. So I think quite similar in terms of how it matters for a company and how you evaluate a startup. There was a question in the chat which I think is related to this, and I'm just trying to take a few questions from there. And it is, what are the biggest mistakes a founder makes when they're raising capital? And so I'm sure you hear like thousands of pitches, Asad. You made a lot of great founders, some you love, some you missed out on, but some which are probably great products, but there are just silly mistakes that founders are making when they're trying to raise capital. So what are some of those common ones that we could learn from?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, you could get a million different answers to this question, but maybe I'll focus mine on something we were talking about, which is sort of founder investor fit. And most broadly, I guess I would say, I think the process of fundraising is not intended to convince every single investor you talk to that your business is one they should invest in. I think the way to view it is, it's a process that should help you find the right investor for your business and your team. And they should have conviction in what you are doing. They should share your fundamental conviction, but they should also be able to help you see around corners and be the kind of partner that you want. And so, if you think about risk and uncertainty, any startup has risk. If you don't feel there's risk or uncertainty, you're missing something. You might not be being ambitious enough, maybe, but likely there is risk and uncertainty. And the way we think about it internally is, we actually, in all of our memos, I don't know if I've shared the Bazaar one with you, but we certainly talked about them. We have a section about, look, what could go wrong, right? What would be the reasons we would look back and say, here's why this didn't work out. And our job is to focus on what could work out and what could go right and build towards that. But you have to be pragmatic about what the risks are. So I think figuring out what are the known unknowns of the business, and then acknowledging there will be unknown unknowns that will come up, and you'll have to handle them as they come up. And I think that exercise of, okay, what are the sort of known unknowns? What are the things that are risky, that are uncertain, that are maybe sources of anxiety, the things that, metaphorically would keep you up at night? And focusing, not feeling like those are things that you have to sort of, convince people are okay enough, but rather actually using conversations with investors to explore those things, to explore hypotheses around those things, to say, okay, here's what we think. Here's how we think we can mitigate this risk. And that's a test for your investors or your potential investors, right? That's a way to see how do they think about the problem? What level of conviction do they have? What sort of depth of thinking do they have in this market? Are there ways in which, their ideas, their backgrounds, their networks, et cetera, can be helpful to you, can be meaningful in the journey of the company? And focusing on that as a way to figure out what investors are the right partners for you, I think is really, really important. And so, I think it can sort of sound simple to say, okay, the fundraising process is a process that should help you find the right investor for your business. But I see a lot of founders who, sometimes end up spinning their wheels trying to convince certain investors instead of just, moving on and focusing their efforts on people who they share those vision and values with. And the truth is, a lot of founders tend to be, ambitious, smart people. They're not really used to hearing that many no's. They're used to being really successful, and so you expect that to continue in your fundraising conversations. But high level, I would say focusing on finding the right investors and not wasting your time being too broad, and really honing in on, going back to your prompt on, what would make you choose us, the things that matter, right? You have strong communication, you have the ability to disagree productively. Is it someone you can see yourself working with and be proud to work with for a decade, which is, what early stage companies can take. And it's a long-term relationship. There are lots of ups and downs. So you have to test for that. And I think optimizing for, okay, who are the, maybe 1, 2, 3 people I meet during this process that fit all those boxes is really, really important, as opposed to being too broad with your fundraise process.
And speaking of that, there was someone asking, is this a good time to even raise capital? When is a good time to raise capital, just globally or even for a Pakistani startup? And how much has AQ invested in the last 12 to 18 months? How much do you plan to invest in the next 12 to 18 months? So how's it looking?
I think, if you look at the history of businesses in general, but certainly of venture capital and startups as an industry, it tends to be a cyclical industry. And I think we've all experienced that over the past few years, decade or so, multiple times actually. And I think, one thing that has remained true over multiple cycles is incredible companies have been built in every cycle. And there have been really strong outcomes in every cycle. And almost regardless of, was the fundraising environment really friendly, was it difficult, et cetera, companies have been able to raise capital, have been able to execute, and have been able to build really lasting, enduring businesses. And so, I guess what I would say is there's a lot of noise in markets, and it can be distracting to be, reading either the sort of, it feels like everyone else is raising type articles, or the doom and gloom type articles, or conversations, or podcasts, or whatever it is. And I, as a fund, our model is we, tend to make meaningful investments. We want to work really closely with our founders. And as a result, we don't make that many investments per year, because our entire model is typically we're doing things like taking board seats, we're working closely with the founders. And we want to be able to commit that level of time and attention and care to founders. And so for us, that means we're doing, per partner, maybe a couple investments every year. And, we've 5 partners. And that has been really consistent. If you look back the past few years, we have really not deviated much from that. Every year, because we have met founders that we believe are building companies that are going to change the world every year, regardless of cycle, regardless of atmosphere and environment. And it might have some impact on, valuations tend to shift a little bit, maybe round sizes tend to shift a little bit based on what's happening in the market. But the fundamental, good ideas, good innovation, good teams come together in all market environments. And actually right now, I would say, when things compared to a year or two ago feel a bit more challenge. Maybe it feels like maybe putting aside some of the AI markets, we've taken a little bit of a breath and tempered the enthusiasm or maybe exuberance. I would say it's a really, really good time to build and raise capital because you have a little bit more space for focus and you have a little bit less noise. So, I mean, that's how we think about it. Our principle is sort of more oriented around consistency. Um, I'm curious to turn it back to you. You guys raise, I mean, 100 million. You're based in Pakistan. That comes with its own challenges when you're raising capital, especially when you're raising growth rounds. And you guys raised in multiple different environments. I mean, I think the market became more understood as you guys were building the company, partly because you guys were building the company. So how did it feel, and how do you advise people who ask you, I'm sure, the same question?
Yeah, no, I think it's a solid question, and we've gone through almost 4 years now. So in 11 days, Bazaar turns 4 on June 1st. Feels like a decade, and I think, and I talk a lot about this because I really do believe that if and when Bazaar is successful, and any of the little success we have had so far, just in terms of progress, all goes back and goes beyond just the reason why we started, right? And I think that mission has to be so clear that no matter what happens in terms of economic crisis, in terms of political crisis, in terms of global tech valuation, venture capital cycles, that it rallies you through beyond most of them. And I think for Bazaar, it has always been, ever since we decided to move back home, Hamza and I, we were living together in Dubai, enjoying a very good life. And the whole thesis was there is a fifth largest country in the world that we were born in. We've spent all our lives there. Everywhere we go in the world, whether that's San Francisco or Canada or Australia or Europe, you meet some incredible Pakistanis. You see these Pakistanis doing exceptionally well in technology. They are the VP of engineering of some of the best companies in the world. They are partners at global tech companies and global venture capital firms. Every now and then you meet just this exceptional Pakistani who was actually born and raised in the country. So you have great talent, clearly. You have a very, very large market. And then when you look at some of the numbers, internet penetration is growing fast, extremely fastly. You have a very young population. It just made absolute no sense that we don't have a homegrown success story in technology emerge out of Pakistan, especially when so much of the technology being built for the world is now increasingly being built from Pakistan. And the more you talk to people about why that is the case, is because just no one wants to
Yes.
um, doubt that Pakistan can build a successful, large, sustainable, profitable, multi-billion dollar institution. And that just made no sense to us. So it goes back to your point, you have to be a bit delusional. And we are delusional. We believe that you can build a multi-billion dollar story out of Pakistan. You can do that by building a business in Pakistan and for Pakistan. Um, and you can attract some of the best funds in the world because at least for Bazaar, the problem that we're going after in Pakistan has a size of about $200 billion in a few years of time. And we have maybe like captured less than 1% of it today because it's so large and it moves our economy. So Bazaar operates in the whole retail landscape where there is trade happening in small stores where you're buying groceries, in pharmacies where you're buying medicine, in industries where people are selling chemicals, in offices where people are procuring inventory. All that is just happening non-digitally today. And it's
Yeah.
so important. And because it's happening non-digitally, there's literally no access to financing and capital. Um, And today, as we stand, there is very little competition in a digital space for the likes of Bazaar. And so um, I don't think we went out of our way to tell any investor about something that was just from an investment perspective. And I think the idea has always been uh, go after a large market, believe in the potential of Pakistan, believe in the potential of the people and talent in Pakistan, hire a great team, build a great culture, defy the odds while doing that. And if you keep doing this, and if you keep building a great business, and if you're building a business not just because you want to sell it, but because you fundamentally believe in it, capital will follow and you will find the right people and you will find the right partners. For example, we actually didn't reach out to Tiger, right? They actually reached us. And then the conversation started from there. Um, we actually met you very randomly through our great friend Kamil, who was like, hey, you should talk to this Pakistani friend of mine who's very awesome, and you guys are awesome, and you guys will figure out what you want to do. And so I think you have to be focused, you have to be driven by a mission that is much larger than just doing a startup for the sake of a startup. It's painful. Um, and if you have these core fundamentals in place, if your heart is in the right place, if you're building a solid business, if you're working very hard, I think capital will follow if you're doing all the right things. And so, at least that's how we think about it. We don't get too distracted on how we're talking about our business and telling things which are not true. In most investment meetings, even to you, we have said, hey, Pakistan is a very high risk market. So are you sure you want to invest in it? And actually, the people that invested in Bazaar have invested in multiple high risk markets and have seen that you can build great businesses in high risk markets because eventually the market is large enough and it is going to be digitized and there will be value that can be created. So that was the way we did it. I always say this, we have been very lucky in our journey. We have found the right people ever since the start, ever since Atif from Indus Valley Capital joined and invested the first check, joined the board. He made the connections to the right people at the right time, including DeFi, that then recommended and introduced you to us.
Yeah.
Um, Finding the right partners early on is also very helpful. Um, but just to wrap up, I think we have just a few minutes left, Asad, just to close it off. As a final question for you, what's the best piece of advice you have ever received, and how did it shape your approach to venture capital?
Um, well, it's interesting because the advice I always come back to, I think you actually very beautifully captured uh, just now, which is, the way I heard it was 6 words. The score takes care of itself. And this was, originally it was legendary American football coach, Bill Walsh. And, the way he summarizes it is basically concentrate on the things that will produce results rather than all the results. Focus on the process, don't focus on the prize. And I think for all the reasons you mentioned, right, with Bazaar and startups and venture capital, there are long feedback cycles. It takes a long time to get to the destination if there is a destination. And so it's so important to not be distracted, to focus on the things that produce results. And it requires a lot of discipline, but you have to remember that a lot of the sort of the noise or the optics, the big funding round, the big media piece, the fireside chat with the founder of Bazaar, the HBS class, whatever it is, right? None of that counts for anything if you're not always focused on what will produce results. So you have to identify what are the things, just as you said, are the core of what you believe in that will always be true, regardless of the ups and downs of the outside world, and you just have to be focused on that. And if you do that, when you look up at the scoreboard, you're probably going to be happy with what you see. So I really love that concept. Score takes care of itself. I think it's very applicable to startups. I think it's very applicable to working in startups. I think it's very applicable to investing in startups, and something that we would do well to remember.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Asad, for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you so much for backing Bazaar, and I hope you continue to stay excited about startups in Pakistan. You continue to help them out as many start their journeys, both on early stage and growth stage. We have a lot of context on things we can learn from, and hope you find many more to invest in. I think our startup needs, our ecosystem needs a lot more investment, especially from great funds like yours. We have been very thankful for how much you have helped us. So hope we can do more. Hope we can do more here. But thank you so much for spending your Sunday morning with us. Sorry about Arsenal. I think next season will be.
Well, we've invested in one Pakistani startup, and that has been a pleasure and an incredible journey that we're very grateful to be a part of. So, the pattern matching is good. And if anyone listening to this is thinking about building something, starting something, I'm always very happy to be a sounding board. Just send me an email, reach out to me. And yeah, glad we could do this together. Thank you, Saab. This was fun.
Awesome. Thank you, Asad, and thank you everyone for joining in. See you guys soon.
Thanks, everyone.